Welcome. Today we are talking about Immanuel Kant, the greatest philosopher of the 18th century. Because he lived to 1804, you might even want to push it back into the 19th century, although the 19th century, the field of great philosophers, begins to get a little more crowded. 1724 to 1804, Prussian by birth, Immanuel Kant. Really after him, the 19th century philosophy is really in response to Kant. And in many ways, Kant kind of answers that debate that exists between Descartes and Hume. Others, of course, will come in and say that they can complete Kant or resolve all of the problems that Kant might have left. Kant didn't think he left any problems, and he will address things in a very sort of direct way. And this kind of unites, in some ways, notions of rationalism and empiricism. And this is what we will see today. As a philosopher, Kant really is the archetype in many ways of idealism, or later German idealism, which will kind of grow and dominate a lot more into the 19th century. And idealism is this sort of approach of trying to say, yes, we learn things through experiences, but there would be some a priori knowledge that we do possess. And also kind of finding that sort of line of what do we actually know based on our experiences is kind of Hume developed and thought. And this is really kind of the goal that Kant had, trying to unite the rationalism and empiricism. Really, well, we're going to kind of think of Descartes as our rationalist. Really, Kant is reacting not as much to Descartes, the Frenchman, as he is to his fellow German, that of Leibniz, who we will address shortly, and trying to find ways between all of these systems, and again, develops an answer for those. He lived during most of the 18th century, 1724 to 1804, and he really wanted to push this idea that we have an intelligence and that we should use it. In fact, a saying of Kant that I particularly like is that we should have the courage to use our own intelligence. Go ahead and use your own thoughts and do that. It is a courageous act to use your own intelligence instead of just accepting the thoughts of others. He was born in Königsberg, East Prussia, which at this time is a part of Germany. Today, it's not, but during Kant's lifetime it was. He was the fourth child of a saddle maker. His parents were both pietists, one of that religious sect that really looked at experiential religion, and this idea in valuing experiences, but yet also the objective truth behind those experiences. We could probably see some of this religious ideas impacting his philosophy. He'll spend most of his time supporting himself with school by tutoring the wealthy students. As a child of a saddle maker, he was not exactly an aristocrat in any sort of way. His school interests really included notions of physics and astronomy, as well as philosophy. As he would get older, he never really got married, was much more interested in academics than anything else. Following school, he'll end up becoming a private tutor in East Prussia for about 9 years. In 1755, he'll obtain a higher degree and a low post on that faculty. In other words, he kind of like an adjunct instructor or a long-term lecturer sort of thing that he's going to be able to teach. But again, not the high positions, not the tenured full professor where he's going to rake in some money or anything else. Again, he'll end up having this low-paying professor gig for about 15 years until 1770, when he's finally appointed as a full professor. His lectures were said to enthrall his students with knowledge and eloquence and wit. Everyone just would love to run into his class and listen to him. Again, we saw a very similar sort of thing here with Aquinas, that his lectures, everyone would want to cram into the rooms or sit out in the halls if you could just hear him. And the same thing was happening with Kant. But like you probably saw with Aquinas, your encounters, and is definitely the case with Kant, his writings were difficult, technical, and for Kant, as is the case with Aquinas, rather numerous. We have astronomical treatise in 1755, dissertation on the forms and principles of sensible and intelligent worlds in 1770, critique of pure reason in 1781, probably one of the most important works in philosophy. Works on metaphysics, both future metaphysics and metaphysics of morals in the 80s as well. Critique of practical reason, kind of a follow-up on the critique of pure reason, was done in 1788. And of course, at this point, he says, I will not write any more critiques, 2 are enough, and subsequently writes Critique of Judgment in 1790. Yeah, that's kind of the way things are done. He'll also write on other works on politics of the day, religion, and he would just write profusely, but it was very much in this sort of technical style that is dry and a little hard to comprehend for modern audiences. This was kind of seen as what philosophy was supposed to be like. You were supposed to write it in this language, and Kant was a master of it, but again, it makes approaching it, especially for a modern audience, including even the audience of Kant, a little more difficult. Oddly enough, Kant, to be able to get everything done, had a fairly firm daily schedule that he kept, which is a rather odd sort of idea. He'd wake up every day at 4:45, drink some tea, smoke his pipe, and plan out his day. Most of the day would be roughly the same as we see here, right? So it was probably more drinking tea and smoking his pipe. At 6 o'clock, he'll prepare for his lectures for the day. At 7 o'clock, he began teaching. I know most of you would not be all that excited about a 7 a.m. class, but that's if you wanted to do it with Kant. You'd be, in his classes between 7 to about 9 or so. And 9 or 10, depending on when the classes will end. He'll end up writing. He'll have a large lunch/dinner, language of the day, at noon and take a walk. After the walk, he will read and write more until 10 o'clock, and then at 10 o'clock, he will go to bed. Now, again, this didn't look all that exciting, and most of us would say, what else are you planning out your day and waking up so early to do? Well, there were some breaks from this daily schedule. It said that Kant loved the society of women. What are the society of women? They're social gatherings. They're the salons of Europe at this time. That's really what it's being talked about. Usually women would host these salons where they would invite philosophers and other intellectuals, and people would talk about matters of the day, politics, what should be done, how are we going to look at things, right? And so this is kind of the way that he would live it up. He would be involved in these salons. And again, he would speak on politics of the day. It wasn't just philosophy. The politics of the day for Kant, very notably, included things like the US and French revolutions. He liked the ideas behind both of them, and generally he supported both, although he really didn't like the reign of terror that's associated with the French Revolution. And so we end up having this sort of import as well, right? He's very much engaged in life, and it's not just speculative, but for Kant this has a grounding in our experiences and what matters to us. Now, Kant wouldn't exist, or at least his philosophy, as well as it does, if it wasn't for Hume. Hume's notion that ideas were separate from the events really intrigued Kant in his development as a philosopher. He thought that Hume's conclusion concerning cause and effect was hasty and mistaken, which I would agree with. But Kant was a little more generous and said, well, at least it was based upon investigation. Right? Again, he had the courage to use his own intelligence, even if he was wrong with it at the end of the day, right? That he was at least trying, and he thought about it, and he was investigating, and he was trying to figure out what he could actually do. It's said that Kant once remarked that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers. That reading Hume was controversial enough in his own mind that he said, you know what, I might want to reapproach this. I might want to address some of these ideas. Still, Kant argued that Hume could not explain, however, how it was that ideas disconnected in one's mind came together in some object of thought. And this became a large critique of his, right? That it never occurred to him that the mind itself might be the author of the experience of its object, that this becomes a very serious challenge to Hume that Kant is launching, and that Hume could never be reconciled with other philosophers such as Locke, somebody else that Kant will admire and that we will address later on. Kant's major philosophical work outside of the realm of morals and really kind of dealing with notions of reason, as we've been addressing already with that sort of debate of what can be known and how can we know it, between Hume and Descartes and Bonaventure obviously in there as well, and we can add others later on into this same sort of debate. But he addresses this in his critique of pure reason. He says that we have seen that everything which the understanding draws from itself, without borrowing from experience, is nevertheless possesses only for the behoof and use of experience. So he's going to say that there is this a priori knowledge, but it's in service of experience, right? The principles of the pure understanding, whether constitutive a priori as mathematical principles or merely regulative as the dynamical, contain nothing but the pure schema, as it were, of possible experience. So he's kind of giving a little debt here to Hume that it's at least in service of our experience, even though they are a priori. For experience possesses its unity from the symmetrical unity, which the understanding, originally and from itself, imparts the synthesis of the imagination in relation to apprehension. Once again, strong notions of apprehension. We're drawing on Bonaventure and others, right? And in an a priori relation to an agreement with which phenomena as data for possible cognition must stand. So again, what does this mean? I know a lot of you might have read this and kind of glazed over. It means everything we know, whether from a priori principles or a posteriori experience, takes place in the mind. Right? Everything we know still is going to be found and furnished in the mind, that this is the strength of all this. And we see the debt here to Hume, even though we also have very clear connections with Descartes and others. So what does this mean about understanding things as they exist, as they are, or as term Kant will use, in themselves? The term for this, by the way, is noumena. It means, because everything's existing in our mind, that we don't truly know them. We don't truly know things as they are in themselves for Kant. All understanding comes from the senses and is categorized in our mind. He continues, the principles of the pure understanding relate only to the general conditions of a possible experience, to objects of the senses, and never to things in general, apart from the mode in which we unite them. So we have these sort of large principles or categories of our understanding, and these become the conditions for our experience. We're still having our mind interpreting these things, and it's all based upon the sensory experience and our preconceived notions, our expectations, our impressions, and our apprehension. But it's all falling within these categories. This is good because of I value it or not, right? Now, as the understanding possesses no other fundamental conception besides the categories, it takes for granted that an object considered as a thing in itself must be capable of being thought by means of these pure conceptions, and is thereby led to hold a perfectly undetermined conception of an intelligible existence as something out of a sphere of our sensibility, for a determinate conception of an existence which we can cognize in some way or other by means of the understanding. Right? See, we have these sort of categories in our mind, and this is how we're going to judge and understand reason. We create different categories of things in our mind and have different judgments on these categories. And again, we have notions of apprehension, and we have clearly Bonaventure to look at within this, right? The class of nomina, right, those things in themselves, have no determinate object corresponding to them. The actual thing in itself we don't know, and therefore we're fitting it into our categories, and cannot therefore possess objective validity. We can't objectively know what something is. We understand it conditionally or categorically, to this notion of categories. A fun sort of pun when we're talking about Kant as well, which we will get to that, don't worry about it. Ergo, we cannot really know the things in themselves. Again, our mind is the one who's doing all this functioning. Our mind is using our experiences, but our experiences are then shaped in our mind through both notions of apprehension and, Kant is adding on, through the idea that we then categorize events, thoughts, experiences, etc. And so the experiences of the outside objective world are then shaped through our mind and perceived in ways that is not what it really is, because we can't really know what an object is. We probably need an example to really understand what Kant is talking about. This is a fairly broad concept, but when we start to apply it in a certain way, it probably will make sense to most of you at this point. So let's take an object. I don't know, any object. Probably, I don't know, a tree. We seem to be fairly familiar with this concept already at this point. We cannot know the actual tree. We don't know, to borrow the German from Kant, the Ding aus sich, the thing in itself, right? There's a barrier around the thing in itself, and it keeps us from really knowing the object. Again, the thing in itself, we can use the German, but the official term, right, is nomina. We don't know the nomina here. But there are gaps in this wall that separate the nomina from ourselves, and this is where we can start to learn, right? There are gaps. It is not only in the mind, but in also our experience. So we can kind of get some sort of impressions of the tree, of the nomina, and have experience of it that makes it through this sort of barrier where we can't actually know the thing in itself. That which makes it through the barrier are experiences, and this is known as phenomena. So we have nomina and phenomena, right? This is the terminology that is being used here. That we can see the leaves and the trunk and the colors and the textures, right? Our eyes, our vision can kind of see all that, and all of that is coming through the barrier. It's given to us by the object itself, and we're receiving it as phenomena, not as nomina. We can hear the wind in the leaves and the sounds that it makes, also escaping from this barrier that exists separating nomina from what we can understand, which is the phenomena. We can even smell it if we are so inclined. We then can create a judgment based upon the previous knowledge and our experiences of the phenomena and produce an understanding of the tree, and therefore we can categorize it in our mind. We now have a category of tree. Right? So it's not that treeness exists, except for as a potential subcategory in our mind, right? Objects, etc., this sort of thing, and we would have a category that would include trees, and therefore this thing fits a category, and therefore it's appropriately understood in our mind as tree. So this is a very different sort of understanding than Plato with the realm of ideas, because again, it's in your mind, and therefore it's your categorization that's going to take place and help advance this idea. We do not know, and we cannot know, the tree in itself. This is impossible for Kant. But we do know the object through our experiences and our mind's categorization, judgments, and perceptions of the object through the perceivable phenomena and our previous experiences and mental formulations. Even if you didn't have any previous experience of a tree, you do have certain mental formulations which you're going to say, oh, it's either like something, and look, it's a big shrub, or I like green, it has some sort of attraction. It shows me life, etc. And therefore you'll have some sort of other mental formulation that's going to then shape your experience of the tree. But again, you'll never truly know the tree in itself. You don't know the nomina, you just know the phenomena. This is much more than what Hume would have allowed for, right? We have knowledge, experience, and the mind. It's not just interpretations of an experience where it's all taking place through this experience that Hume is advocating, right? All conclusions come from the mind alone. Yes, this is indeed something that Kant is advocating. The mind also creates these categories of understanding, that we don't know things as they are, only the phenomena from them, and we assume that things to be known must conform in advance to our knowledge process. Knowledge tells us something about an object of thought before it becomes part of our experience. But now we also have experience, right? We have our mind ahead of time and we have experience. We have both. And it's not just all on one or all on the other, that both have validity in the understanding. Experience, all experience, is a kind of knowledge that involves the mind. Knowledge begins with experience, yet not all knowledge is derived from experience. This is a key middle ground here for Kant and what he's advocating. Hegel, by the way, will disagree with Kant specifically over this issue, and we'll get to that later. Abstract knowledge is called pure when it contains no trace of experience. So we do have some notions of abstract knowledge that doesn't have any sort of experience as the ground for it. Imagination, therefore, Kant says, is man's prior and necessary capacity to organize things. And this makes us call it productive imagination. So it is the imagination which helps create these categories, but they are based upon our experience. So again, our imagination helps us, and our imagination is based upon this experience. And again, that very much kind of fits within Hume, but again, it's not just that. So we have this as a different. Our imagination is a function of our mind, which then makes these judgments as well. So we have imagination, but it also is this notion of judgment. And at this point, we do also kind of move back a little bit to the ideas of Bonaventure and Descartes, where through apprehension and the senses being brought in, we're judging them. We either like them or not. We find it profitable or not. Now, why? Kant isn't going as far as Bonaventure of because it resembles God, etc. But we do have this notion of judgment. Kant continues that there are two kinds of judgments. We have analytic and synthetic or amplifying judgments. Analytic, the predicate merely analyzes the subject, while synthetic or amplifying, the predicate adds something to the judgment, to the subject. So these are the different ways that we can have judgment on something. We're either analyzing it by itself and just saying, oh, I like this, it's good, bad, etc. It's got quality that is good. Or we're going to add it into something else or amplify it and grow it. Hume fails, according to Kant, and many of us might agree, because he doesn't give the experience its value, right? That we can't really truly even know experience as part of the idea, because we only see causes, we don't see connections here, right? So our experiences are really lacking for Hume, nor the idea that the mind may know or perceive things to actually be true, even when based upon notions of complete knowledge. Kant says that we can never have complete knowledge, but what we know is enough. That we might not know everything, but we know enough, and we're doing well enough. This is actually rather dangerous, though. It might not seem dangerous, but for the realm of philosophy, for 18th century and 19th century, with fervor of revolution all about and everything else, this is dangerous thought. Because if it's all in our mind, where is reality? who's to say, right? Who's to say what is real if it's just my experience and I don't actually know reality? I can't know the real thing. I don't really know the tree. Even if I'm staring at it, even if I'm touching it, even if I'm tasting it and hearing it and smelling it, even if I'm using all of my senses, I still don't know it. And this doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to be a tree, but I don't know it. I don't know the thing in itself. I only am able to go through my perceptions and my judgments and my categories, right? And it doesn't necessarily reveal a greater reality. At least this becomes the fear. And so Kant is dangerous. This is why Kant is banned all over the place. This is why Kant is not allowed to be taught or read at different points of the 18th and 19th century. Because where is reality? Who's to say? How can you say? And what can we do with that? Hopefully that makes sense. Kant's division of things between noumena and phenomena, and his synthesis of Bonaventure, Descartes on one side, and Hume on the other, is really enough to kind of elevate him in our discussion of philosophy. But he also speaks and is very important and authoritative in the realm of morality as well. And this is where we're going to get, famously, the categorical imperative. Essential to this understanding for Kant, nothing can possibly be conceived of in the world, or even out of it, which can be called good without qualification except a good will. This is the starting point for Kant and his discussion of morality, that it is based upon a good will. And this school of thought of this is going to be referred to as Deontology. That it's not notions of virtue, as we would talk about with Aristotle, nor is it about consequences and discussions of consequentialism. It's not about the outcome, but it is about the will that's going to then make an action good or bad. And again, we almost have this weird, where does reality exist discussion with Kant once again. If I can't really know an object, where is reality? And if what is going to determine if something is good or not is the will and not, for instance, a concrete consequence, then how do I know if an action that somebody else is doing, if they have a good and pure will, and whether or not it is good? These are valid questions, and we're kind of almost left with this idea that Kant is just letting anything go, even though that's definitely not the impression that a lot of people have of Kant. That we have this sort of balancing act that needs to be done. Kant will say, the sight of a being who is not adorned with a single feature of a pure and good will, enjoying unbroken prosperity, can never give pleasure to an impartial, rational spectator. Thus, a good will appears to constitute the indispensable condition even of being worthy of being happy. Right? So you need to have a good will to even consider the idea that you are worthy of happiness. A good will is good not because of what it performs or affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition, and of your desiring it, your will. That is, it is good in itself. We can't know the thing in itself, but we do know goodness in itself. And considered by itself is to be esteemed much higher than all that can be brought about by it in favor of any inclination, nay, even the sum total of all inclinations. So it's not just what you're wanting, but what is it that you're willing? And this is the important starting point for Kant in the realm of morality. For as reason is not competent to guide the will with certainty in regard to its objects and the satisfaction of our wants, which it to some extent even multiplies, this being an end to which an imparted instinct would have led with much greater certainty. And since nevertheless reason is imparted to us as a practical faculty, i.e., as one is to have influence on the will, again, we have value and reason on its own, that it's not just based upon experience, to go to our further discussion, right? Therefore, admitting that nature generally, in the distribution of her capacities, has adapted the means to the end, its true destination must produce a will, not merely good as a means to something else, but good in itself, for which reason is absolutely necessary. Reason itself is going to tell us what is good, and what is good then is for us to will what is reasonable, i.e., what is good. This will then, though not indeed the sole and complete good, must be the supreme good and the condition for every other, even the desire for happiness. Even the desire for happiness should be based, and truly is based, on what is good, according to Kant. We have then to develop the notion of a will which deserves to be highly esteemed for itself, and is good without a view of anything further, a notion which exists already in the sound natural understanding, requiring rather to be cleared up than to be taught, and which, in estimating the value of our actions, always takes the first place and constitutes the condition of all the rest. Right? It is the will which is going to determine if something is good, and therefore everything else will line up within this, that it is good in itself without the view of anything further, right? That it is on top of everything else. It is the pinnacle to which everything else will become subservient to. This will decide what is good. The second proposition is, according to Kant, that an action done from duty derives its moral worth, not from the purpose which is to be attained by it, but by the maxim to which it is determined, and therefore does not depend on the realization of the object of the action, but merely on the principle of volition by which the action takes place, without regard to any object of desire. Right, so here again, we see that he's clearly a non-consequentialist, that it is values are done because of the will and not the outcome. Choices cannot be justified by their effects. That no matter how morally good the consequences, some choices are morally forbidden because the will is bad. The preeminent good, which we call moral, can therefore consist in nothing else than the conception of law itself. Now again, the notion of law he's talking about is a law of morality. He is not addressing some sort of law such as what has been passed by Congress or any of that other sort of, an executive order, some sort of speeding ticket trap law or whatever, right? No, the idea of a law itself, he's talking about this moral law which objectively exists, which is based upon the will towards it, right? So, which certainly, he continues, is only possible in a rational being. Irrational beings, animals, etc., don't really have a ability to understand or approach the law, and therefore morality doesn't really exist with them. Insofar as this conception and not the expected effect determines the will. So if your will is in accordance with this law of morality, then the action, or then what's being produced, is good, even if the consequence is bad. This is good which is already present in the person who acts accordingly, and we have not want to wait for it to appear first in the result. This becomes the notion of an imperative, that you have to do it, that this is the way that this is being directed. Now, what is an imperative? All imperatives, he said, are expressed with the word ought or shall, right, and thereby indicate the relation of an objective law of reason to a will. You ought to do something, tells you that you should do it, that there is a moral compulsion to that. Now, all imperatives command either hypothetical or categorical. Right? And these are the two sorts of
categories, as it were, of imperatives. The former, that of hypothetical imperatives, represent a practical necessity of a possible action as means to something else that is willed, or at least what might possibly be willed. For instance, if you want this, you ought to do that. If you want to get an A in the class, you ought to submit all of your work, proofread it, etc. Right? This is a hypothetical imperative. If you don't want an A in the class, then obviously we're discussing something different. If you're just, you know what, I'm here to learn and enjoy and whatever, and I don't really care about my grades, then then the imperative doesn't apply to you. Right? If you want to know how to fly, you ought to flap your wings. Well, I don't have wings and I don't want to fly, and okay, or something like that, where it's not even practical. The categorical imperative would be that which represented an action as necessary in itself without reference to another end, i.e. as objective necessary. Right? A categorical imperative is different than a hypothetical because you have to do it. It is a condition. It's not a if you want that. It is the you just ought to do that. You ought not to murder somebody. It's not as if you're thinking about it. It's not, well, if you want an A in this class, you ought not to murder somebody thing. We're like, oh, I'm fine with a B. I'm going to kill people, right? That's not what he's saying. The categorical imperatives exist always, regardless of the condition. So this is the idea of the imperative and the categorical imperative. So at long last, we have found ourselves in Kant's categorical imperative, his major contribution to notions of morality. The categorical imperative, according to Kant, says this principle then is the supreme law, this law of morality. Act always on such a maxim as thou can at the same time will it to be a universal law. This is it. This is the sole condition under which a will can never contradict itself. And as such, the imperative is categorical. So is an action moral? Can you act in such a way that what you're wanting to do as a maxim can be the same for all people and all places and all times? Is this okay or not? Is this universal? Well, no, it's just right now I want this, and therefore I need. No, that would not be that would be a hypothetical imperative. Morality is based within notions of categorical imperatives. And so this is the way you need to look at it. Can you will that lying is universally okay? Well, no, you can't, because if lying is okay, then you won't trust anything anyone ever says. And therefore, communication breaks down. And we're no longer rational creatures as we can't trust anything. Therefore, I cannot act in such a way that I can lie, because I can't will that lying becomes universally okay. Now, I might want to say I will that I can lie in this moment, but that's, again, hypothetical and not categorical. It's not really moral from Kant's perspective. There is a second part to the broader conception when he's talking about the categorical imperative and his shaping of morality. And he says that this is a principle. He says, so as to act in regard to every rational being, thyself and others, that he may always have placed thy maximum as an end in himself. It is accordingly essentially identical with the other, act upon the maximum which at the same time involves its own universal validity for every rational being. So, right, we need to act in such a way that whatever it is that we're willing could be universal law, but this is wrapped up with the idea that every other rational being, every other person, is an end in themselves and not simply a means to an end. Now, you might also be a means, but you're not solely a means to an end. So you might have a relationship with somebody that you're, buying something from, the cashier at the store, right? And they're ringing something up. they're serving a function for you. They're a means to an end. They are the middleman between the transaction of whatever the product is you want and you having it. But you still have to, in that interaction with that clerk, treat them as an end. Give them the dignity of being a rational creature. And therefore, notions of courtesy might be extended to them. And so these kind of help you know if an action is moral or not, according to Kant. This is how you should regard things. Can you wish that it becomes universal law? And in that, are you treating every rational being as an end in themselves? And this then tells you if your will is based upon something that is moral and is the notion of morality itself. Once again, Kant's notion of the categorical imperative and morality is one of those major branches of ethics known as deontology, right? That it is your duty to do so. The term comes from the word duty itself, so that's easy to kind of see it here. It tells us what we ought to do, and this is the guide to make decisions. They are intrinsic values in every choice, and you must do the right one. Kantianism is kind of ubiquitous for the notion of deontology and these moral systems, each of which different deontological schools claim to be Kantian in some way. There are three branches of deontological ethics. There's the agent-centered, the patient-centered, and the constructuralist. For the agent-centered, each agent has certain obligations that they must follow that may be shared with others but applies to them. In other words, I have a duty as a parent to my children that other people do not, because they're not your children. Now, you have other responsibilities to them because they are people, but I have to, care for them. I have to feed them. I have to house them. I have to nurture them. And this is my duty as a parent to do. You, as somebody who doesn't know them, doesn't have these responsibilities, and I don't have these responsibilities for your children either, if you have them. I have to treat them with respect because they're rational beings. I can't use them as ends. I obviously can't do immoral acts. I can't murder them or lie to them, because we can't will that murdering or lying is universal. And again, that's also using people as means and not as ends. And therefore, I have those obligations to your children. But my limits on what I owe them is, there, while to my own children, it's not. And so, again, you have to worry first about those who you're in a relationship with, who you have obligations to, before focusing on others. So again, it's still about notions of intentions, but again, you have obligations. The patient-centered deontological school generally says it's rights-based rather than duty-based, even though it's still within this notion of duty. What are the rights of people? Do you have a right to life? Therefore, I cannot kill you, even if I've obliged myself and those around to do so for some reason, right? So even if I have you're going to kill my children for the patient-centered deontologist, I can't kill you in defense because I can't kill you because you have rights, the right to not be murdered. And now you're violating my rights, etc. But that's part of the idea, is that it's what is owed universally. And so this is a broader sort of conception in some ways, outward focused, and those obligations are equal to those that would be made internally. And the constructuralist view, morally wrong acts on such accounts are those acts that would be forbidden by principles that people in a suitably described social construct would accept. In other words, would the average person accept that this is right or wrong, and those relationships are going to kind of be built into that. Right? All three of which have this basis or foundation within Kantianism as well, right? Agent-centered is really going to focus on the qualified good is that goodwill. Patient-centered is this injunction against using people as means to ends, while the constructuralist can cite Kant's insistence that maxims are those that should be universal law, right? It's willed for rational agents. So quickly, we might kind of look at a couple of different moral quandaries or situations and see how this might work with Kant and why things might be right or wrong, if it's moral or not. We'll kind of talk about the fact that they're all seeming to go the same direction, possibly. Right? So notions of slavery. Kantianism really says that we cannot do this. Not because we can't will that in battle, instead of killing somebody, you take them as a slave. Because we might will that becomes universal law. We might frame our categorical discussion, our imperative, in that way, that it is better to have somebody as a slave than it is to kill them, possibly. But slavery is wrong for Kant because you're using people then as means and not as ends. There's not the dignity of humanity that's being left if you're taking somebody to make them your slave. And therefore, from the Kantian perspective, this elimination of freedom is using people as means and not ends. And therefore, slavery is an immoral practice. Same sort of notion of subordination of women or any group of people. It doesn't matter why or how or whatever, right? Women are rational creatures as much as men, etc. Therefore, you can't subordinate one group because then you are not treating them as ends. And therefore, we should have equality amongst the sexes, etc. Right? Notions of infant exposure, practices that were done by Greeks and Romans and other cultures, right? You have a child that you don't want and you go and you set it upon the steps of a temple or somewhere else like that, and it stays there until it dies. This isn't supposed, in fact, it was seen as immoral for Roman culture to, pick up that child because now you're shaming the family, and that they would just leave it there until it screams and perishes. Now, can we will that to become universal law? Probably not, because can we do it all the time, everyone? No, then humanity goes away, right? And infants, while not fully rational yet, are still rational creatures by their nature, and therefore would be seen as immoral. Polygamy becomes this weird sort of discussion. Can you will that it's universal? Maybe you can have a good argument for that. Does it treat, generally, polygamy, women as means instead of ends? Maybe not. There's all sorts of cultural values and cultural rules and expectations on what, quote, good polygamy would look like versus bad polygamy. And so this one really kind of depends on one's will, probably engaging on that. Right? Is this, again, are you going to be treating each subsequent wife with dignity and respect afforded to her as a rational creature or not? And that might change that sort of discussion on whether or not it's moral. And some of you might be screaming, no, it's not. And some of you might be screaming, yes, it is. Right? Maybe some of that's based on cultural expectations as well, and not necessarily universal laws wrapped up within that. But again, you might think this through and how this might apply with Kant and his formation of what is ethical. How about lying? Something that is done casually by lots of people all over the place. Right? We can't really will that it's universal law, and the only reason why you do lie is really because you're treating people as means instead of ends, which is also why we can't will that it's universal. Lying is fundamentally a flawed practice when we're addressing it from a moral perspective, and yet some people have ideas of white lies or innocent lies, little lies, that you're like, well, I kind of do it because it's not that bad. Well, maybe, but it's still violating your duty to not lie. You're not treating people as ends. Oh, how's the soup? It's horrible. Maybe you have to tell them that. It's not my favorite. I don't like it. You don't necessarily need to be a jerk about it, but instead of going, oh, it's fine, it's good, when you're like, this is horrible, this is the worst thing I've ever tasted. Why? Well, also, they're going to think, oh, you like it. They're going to give you more of it. You're going to now have suffering more of that. Somebody knocks on your door, I'm here to kill somebody. Are they here? Now, probably the best thing to do would to be refrain from answering. But if you are to answer, you don't lie. Because, again, now you're looking at the consequences instead of the other actions and instead of the will. And so, again, this becomes really kind of tricky for Kant when we're talking about prioritizations of things, right? What takes priority? Saving a life or not lying? Well, again, you're looking at notions of consequences. And from the Kantian perspective, it's about the will. It's not about the consequence. Because Kantian morality is not about the consequences, it's about duty. In some ways, it takes away a lot of the gray that we live with in this world and that we thrive in and that we expect. And it challenges some things in different ways. Do I throw a party for my child because it's my duty as the father to do so? What if I don't want to? I mean, I would actually, but what if I don't? What if I'm a bad father and I go, whatever. I'm only throwing this party because I have to as a father. I'll acknowledge that it's your birthday, whatever, out of a sense of duty, but not out of love. Would that make the party good? Would that actually be something enjoyable? And therefore, are things done purely out of duty, just static and dry and lifeless? And at this point, do they go against maybe what the actual will or intention of an action would be if it's just duty? This is a sort of question that we kind of have as far as, Kantianism goes. Why do I, have to pay taxes? It's my duty. Do I like it? No. What if I think they're too high? Okay, I got to vote on other people or whatever. But morality, how does that apply within all of this? How should you engage with that? Does it matter if you click your heels and smile while you're paying your taxes? Probably not. The money gets spent one way or the other. Why do I want a morality that also doesn't concern itself with happiness might be a question that you're asking yourself. Or even the greatest happiness, which becomes a sort of school of thought for other consequentialist views of morality. There are three branches of ethics. We've talked about Aristotle and his notion of virtue ethics before, and here we have deontology, Kantianism. There's also a group known as consequentialism that looks at the consequences of things, and this is usually paired against Kant of how are we going to look at things? Do we want to care about the will or do we want to look at the consequences? And utilitarianism is kind of the big guy in the consequentialist camp, although there are other discussions of consequentialism as well. Utilitarianism was started loosely by Jeremy Bentham. And he says that the principle of utility is meant that the principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency that it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing in the other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. So utility, to which utilitarianism gets its name from, Bentham says, is this idea that does this action generally help those who are involved be happy or not? So maybe it's going to be better for you to lie because it's going to produce more happiness for you to lie than it would be for you to not lie. This is the argument. Now, Bentham is what's known as an act utilitarian. So every act would have to be weighed out on deciding if it's going to create the most happiness for the most people or not. And so do you want to host a party for your kid? Well, more people are going to be happy about it. Okay, so now I even have to do it even if I don't want to, still under utilitarianism. It's not just about my happiness. In fact, utilitarianism might expect that you're sacrificing your own happiness on many accounts because it's best for the most amount of people. Another utilitarian, John Stuart Mill, is what's known as a rule utilitarian. And so instead of just individual acts determined, is this going to create the most happiness? Under Mill, we're going to have rules. Which rules tend to create more happiness as opposed to less happiness? His discussion here says the creed which accepts the foundation of morals or utility or the greatest happiness principle, you can see back his debt there in a Bentham, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So this becomes a sort of challenge that utilitarianism is launching against deontology. Again, we are looking at the consequences of acts. This is the morality that's being structured by these Englishmen here in the 18th and 19th centuries. And we can kind of play this out a little bit, and I encourage all of you to do so with what's known as the trolley problem. The trolley problem is essentially the idea that there's a trolley, an out-of-control cart. If you do nothing, it's going to run over and kill, let's say, 5 people. But you happen to be standing by the lever. You cannot stop the trolley, but you can pull the lever, which will now move it to go onto another track, which will kill 1 person. Either way, somebody's going to die. This is a basic moral problem, and you can kind of see the divisions here between Kant and deontology on one side and consequentialism and utilitarianism on the other. There's 5 people on one side. That's 5 people who are going to be unhappy that they're dead. That's 5 people's loved ones who are going to be unhappy that they are dead, as opposed to 1. From the consequentialist perspective, you pull the lever and you kill the 1 person. From Kant's perspective, you cannot do that because 1, you're treating that 1 person as a means to an end, saving the other people's lives, and 2, you are the agent responsible making a moral decision that that person ought to die. You are the murderer by pulling the lever. You are actively killing this 1 person. Another version of the trolley problem has been reintroduced to kind of highlight this. Of right, here's the outside, the trolley heading down. Do you push generally seen as a fat man, somebody who has enough mats to stop the trolley? Do you push them off a bridge and kill them? Because you're doing the same thing by pulling the lever. Is 1 more okay or not? Does it matter at all from the consequentialist perspective if, for instance, that 1 fat man might be a brilliant saint and those 5 people might all be old evil criminals who are mass murderers? Does that change it? Right? Here's a young person who might have more years of life as opposed to old people who don't. Here's 1 person that you love as opposed to 5 people that you don't. Does that make a difference? And there's all sorts of fun places that you can look and play around with all of this. MIT has something called the moral machine that runs through different scenarios, and you kind of see what do you do and why do you do it. And I would encourage you all to play around with that as well. Does it matter if it's somebody that you love or hate? Does that change the morality of it? Does it make a difference if it's an animal instead of a person? If you put a dog there instead, does that change your actions and what's moral? Or if it's a priceless work of art, does this change the moral situations? Well, why would it? Why would it not? These are questions for you to address. So today we did a lot. by addressing the life and some of the major contributions of Immanuel Kant. We addressed his critique of pure reason, where he's trying to thread the needle between Hume on one side, who woke Kant from his dogmatic slumbers, but is mistaken in a lot of ideas according to Kant and others. And on the other side, people like Bonaventure and Descartes and Leibniz, who we'll get to next time, and their ideas of how ideas work and our understanding and experience of things go. We also brought in Kant's categorical imperative, his treatment of morality, and the idea that it's done from duty, and that you have to have a good will, and this determines if an action is good or bad, and why it should be done in one way or the other. Play around with these ideas, both moral reasons and ideas reasons, and how this works for you. Do you find these ideas compelling? Do you find any lacking? Go on the Moral Machine website and kind of see where you fit as far as your notions of morality and who you prefer. How do you answer the trolley problem? Is Kant right? Do you just have to do what is right by the will and not kind of what you want to do? Does it make a difference within who or how or why? So have fun. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will talk at you next time.